What's good? What's good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of The Urban Platform Speaks. Make sure to like and subscribe as you tune into the channel and check out the content. And with that being said, I want to speak on a recent discussion that's been going on, and that discussion involves Carmelo Anthony and is Carmelo Anthony a top five New York Knick, right? And I guess this discussion came about because of the Carmelo Anthony was recently inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. So, and some people say, I guess, some people feel like they don't think that Carmelo Anthony is Hall of Fame worthy, which I disagree with. I think uh, Carmelo is definitely, he should be in the Hall of Fame. But then people would take it even a step further and say that Carmelo Anthony, he's not even a top five New York Knick, right? And so I was thinking, and I only go back personally, uh, to probably like the 80s as far as like following the Knicks and just, following basketball in general. And so I'm familiar with Bernard King, Patrick Ewing and those guys, but then some of the names that some of the other names that came up, I wasn't familiar with. I didn't get a chance to actually see these people play. Like for instance, Willis Reed, right? And so Willis Reed played for the Knicks like in the 70s, the early 70s or something around that time, or the late 60s, early 70s. But I do remember seeing like highlights of Willis Reed and that iconic game where Willis Reed got hurt and then he comes back out, comes limping back out onto the court on the bench, and he helped to lead his team to a victory. So, like in my opinion, I think it's going to be hard to say if Carmelo is top five. Like I said, you got Willis Reed, and when you're doing research and stuff like that, and you want to know like how good other players was, part of it is part of your research is that you will have to listen to people and get information from people who were there, people who witnessed it, right? And so, because I don't want to make the mistake of like what like some younger people are doing now is like they're discounting like the older basketball players, like people who you know what was the guy named JJ Redick said that nobody back in the 60s could play, and those guys was just a bunch of plumbers and gas station attendants or something like that. And he kind of pissed off who he pissed off? He pissed off Jerry West and some older guys, who played back in the days. So, now I don't want to, be guilty of making that same mistake because I do believe that, like Dr. Jacob play. He was a very good basketball player. I didn't get to catch all of, like him in his prime and stuff like that, like when he was with the ABA. So, people who know the game, I kind of, just make a judgment based on what they say, like what is the general consensus, as far as like these guys are play. So now, like I said, one of the names that was thrown out there was Willis Reed, right? And you hear when New York Knicks fans, when you talk about the Knicks, you hear a lot about Willis Reed. So I want to go ahead and I'm gonna go ahead and kind of just say, all right, well, cool. If they say that Willis Reed was that man, he was the real deal, then I'm gonna go with that, right? Another guy that you hear a lot about, as far as like when people talk about the New York Knicks, you hear about Clyde Walt Frazier, and so anytime, and Willis Reed and Clyde Frazier played around that same era. And I think they were on that the Knicks championship team that won it like in the early 70s, right? So you got Clyde Frazier, and he was that deal. He was that deal. Like I said, Clyde Frazier was on the team that won the championship for the New York Knicks. And so that's tough, for Carmelo to have to go against Willis Reed, Clyde Frazier. Just their going up against their history alone, you have to really, really, really have to have like some great seasons if you Carmelo Anthony to be, talked about in the same breath as Clyde Frazier and Willis Reed. Then you got Dave DeBusschere. You hear a lot about Dave DeBusschere. Also, he played around that same era, in the late '60s and the early '70s and stuff like that. Who else? Now the guys who I'm familiar with. Oh, Earl Monroe, Earl the Pearl Monroe, another guy that you hear a whole lot about, like when you talk about the history of the New York Knicks, right? And so you got four. You got you got four old school guys that I'm not really familiar with, but every time you hear about the history of the New York Knicks, these names come up. Clyde Frazier, Willis Reed, Dave DeBusschere, um, Earl Monroe. That's four right there, you know. So it'll be tough for Carmelo Anthony to be like in the top five of New York Knicks. And I think all four of these guys right here played, like I mean, when the Knicks was doing their things. So, it's tough. That's four right there. Then you got Bernard King. Now, Bernard King, I was a big fan of Bernard King back in the day when he played. I think Bernard King played he played in the 80s. I remember him playing like in the mid to late 80s with New York, right? And so Bernard King was that dude, as far as like scoring, had a nice mid-range shot. So even if I could put Carmelo Anthony in front of Bernard King, like I said, well, you got the other four guys up there already. So it's only one spot left. So even if I could put Carmelo in front of Bernard King, which I probably wouldn't because I was a big Bernard King fan, but just say for the sake of argument, I put him in front of Bernard King. He would still get knocked of out of the box by Patrick Ewing. Now Patrick Ewing, just like Bernard King, Patrick Ewing didn't win he didn't win a championship. He never got a ring. But Patrick Ewing he kept the New York Knicks relevant for the whole time that he was there. Like New York was they was relevant. They had some epic battles. Patrick Ewing had some epic battles with Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. And so I wouldn't hold the fact that Patrick Ewing didn't get a ring. I wouldn't really. Mike kept a lot of people from getting rings, right? So you kind of gotta really you got to consider that Mike kept a lot of people from getting rings. So and looking at this list of people that was, that was who was really big in New York basketball history, it'll be hard. It'll be very hard to put Carmelo Anthony as a top five New York Knick of all time. You know, Man, that'd be tough. Well, I mean, and I wouldn't even do it personally. I wouldn't do it. I couldn't put Carmelo number five personally because I mean, you got so many great players that play for the Knicks. Players that I've seen and players that I didn't have the honor of seeing. And all of these guys, in my opinion, had more playoff success than Carmelo Anthony. I think Carmelo Anthony, while he was in New York, they won one playoff series the whole time Carmelo was there. And I think Bernard King, and I know that Patrick Ewing, Patrick Ewing had more playoff success than he had more playoff success than Carmelo Anthony. So even though New York hasn't won a championship since like the '70s, they still have a rich basketball tradition. They still have some, they had some guys at New York that could really ball. So it'll be tough, man, to put Carmelo Anthony as a number 5, top 5 New York Knick. Stephen A said that he thought that he was, but then when you hear like of some of these guys, man, the legends, and I'm not going without proof that these guys wasn't that real deal. And these guys, some of these guys have championships where Carmelo Anthony don't have championships. These guys have been able to at least go deep into the playoffs, whereas though Carmelo Anthony wasn't able to do that in New York, and so it's not all of Carmelo Anthony's fault. But if he wants to, if you want to put him as top 5, man, I think, and even when before this debate came about, I never really thought that Carmelo Anthony like had his best years in New York. He had some good years. He had some good, some great games in New York. But I thought he played his best ball when he was at the Denver Nuggets. When he was a little bit younger. Early on in his career, I thought Denver he played his best ball. So yeah, man, I'm gonna have to go. I'm gonna have to say, no, I don't think Carmelo Anthony is top 5 New York Knicks. But I do want your opinion. Let me know what you think, based on like the research, or maybe you was able to see Clyde Frazier and Willis Reed and Dave DeBusschere. Maybe you had the honor of seeing those guys. But I'm a trust the old heads when they say that Carmelo wasn't better than these guys. So with that being said, make sure to like and subscribe. Don't forget to leave a comment, and I will check you all out in the next video. Peace.